Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yoga Karmasu Kaushalam.
Hello students, my name is Ishan Shanolikar and today we will be discussing about indifference curve analysis part 1. Let us start with the objectives of this session. So today we are going to start with an introduction to ordinal utility theory. Then we move on to the concept of indifference curve. Further we look at the concepts of indifference map and indifference schedules. Before moving on to the properties of indifference curve, then looking at an important concept which is marginal rate of substitution and understanding consumer preferences. Finally, we close the session by looking at different types of indifference curves. So let us start with the first aspect, that is introduction to ordinal utility theory. Before we understand the concept, let us look at the evolution from cardinal utility theory, which we have already studied, to ordinal utility theory. The ordinal utility theory emerged in the 1930s as a response to the practical difficulties of measuring satisfaction in exact numbers. Economists J.R. Hicks and R.G.D. Allen reorganized that while consumers can easily say they prefer one combination of goods over another, asking them to specify exactly how much more they prefer is unrealistic and unnecessary. So the basic philosophy of ordinal utility is that it is based on simple idea that consumers can arrange their choices in order of preferences. You can easily say whether you prefer pizza or burgers or a vacation to new clothes without needing to quantify exactly how much you prefer one over the other. This ranking approach mirrors how people actually make decisions in real life. When choosing between different options, we naturally think in terms of better than, worse than, or equally as good as, rather than assigning specific numerical values to our satisfaction levels. The ordinal approach recognizes that what matters for understanding consumer behavior is the order of preferences, not the intensity of feelings. Whether you prefer apples or oranges by a little or lot doesn't change your purchasing decisions. You will still choose apples when given the option. So what are the key assumptions of this theory? The ordinal utility theory rests on several realistic assumptions about consumer behavior. First, it assumes consumers can consistently rank any two combination of goods. They can always say which they prefer or whether they are indifferent between them. Second, it assumes transitivity in preferences. If you prefer combination A to combination B and combination B to combination C, then you must prefer combination A to combination C. This logical consistency is essential for meaningful analysis. Third, the theory assumes that more of any good is generally preferred to less, within reasonable limits of course. This doesn't mean people always want infinite amounts of everything, but rather that additional units of goods provide some benefit until satiation is reached. Now let us look at the concept of indifference curve. So first, if we define the basic idea, then an indifference curve represents all combinations of two goods that provide equal satisfaction to a consumer. The word indifference means the consumer doesn't care which combination they receive. They are equally happy with any point on the entire indifference curve. So this idea is represented by a graph as follows. In this graph, IC means indifference curve and all the points A, B, C, D are different combinations of good X and good Y. What this means is, across the graph you get the same level of satisfaction. So the consumer will be indifferent whether they get option A or option D. Now moving on to the aspect of two good analysis. For simplicity, indifference curve analysis typically focuses on two goods, though the principles can be extended to multiple goods. These two goods might be broad categories like food and clothing, or specific items like apples and oranges. The horizontal axis usually represents the quantity of one of the good, while the vertical axis represents the quantity of second good, as we just saw in the graph. Each point on the graph represents a specific combination of two goods that the consumer might choose. Now let us understand trade-offs from this idea. Indifference curves illustrate the concept of opportunity cost in consumer choice. To get more of one good while staying on the same indifference curve, that is same satisfaction, a consumer must give up some of the other good. The curve shows exactly how much must be sacrificed. These trade-offs reflect personal preferences and circumstances. A busy professional might be willing to give up a lot of leisure time to earn more money, while a retiree might make the opposite trade-off. Different people have different indifference curves reflecting their unique preferences. Now let us move to indifference map and schedule. So from a single curve we are now moving to a complete map. While a single indifference curve shows combinations that provide equal satisfaction, an indifference map shows the complete preference structure of a consumer. It consists of multiple indifference curves, each representing a different level of satisfaction. An indifference map is like a topographic map showing different elevation levels. Higher indifference curves represent higher satisfaction levels, just as higher elevation line represents greater heights above the sea level. Consumers prefer to be on the highest possible indifference curve within their constraints. So if we look at the graph of indifference map, here you can see you have three different indifference curves, and the higher the indifference curve is, it means higher satisfaction, because it just means that you are able to consume more of either one or both the goods. Now let us move to indifference schedule. Before drawing the curves, actually economists often create indifference schedules, which are tables showing different combinations of two goods that provide equal satisfaction. These schedules help organize thinking about preferences and make it easier to understand relationships between different combinations. Moving on, we have the properties of indifference maps. So indifference maps have several important characteristics that make them useful for economic analysis. Higher curves always represent higher satisfaction levels. Consumers prefer to move upward to the right on the map whenever possible. Now let us look at reading an indifference map. So to understand an indifference map, start by identifying higher and lower satisfaction levels. Curves further away from the origin represent higher satisfaction because they involve more of both goods or same amount of one good plus more of the other, as I had explained with the graph. Compare different points by seeing which indifference curve they lie on. If 2 points are on the same indifference curve, the consumer is indifferent between them. If they are on different curves, the consumer prefers the point on the higher curve. So we have some very important properties of indifference curve that we are going to see. First is the downward sloping nature. Indifference curves slope downward from left to right, reflecting the fundamental economic principle of trade-offs. To maintain the same level of satisfaction while consuming more of one good, a consumer must consume less of the other. This downward slope captures the reality of scarcity and choice. Resources are limited, so getting more of one thing typically requires giving up something else. The indifference curve shows exactly what trade-offs have satisfaction unchanged. In an indifference curve, if the curve is sloping upwards, it would mean that a consumer could get more of both goods while maintaining the same level of satisfaction. This would violate the assumption that more is preferred to less, making the analysis meaningless. Then we have convex shaped property or bowed inward. Indifference curves are typically convex to the origin, meaning they bow inward toward the bottom left corner of the graph. This shape reflects the economic principle of diminishing marginal rate of substitution, which we will see in detail later. The convex shape indicates that consumers prefer balanced combination over extreme ones. Most people would rather have some food and some clothing rather than lots of food and very less or no clothing, or the other way around. The next property is non-intersecting property. That is, indifference curves never cross or intersect each other. This property is crucial for maintaining logical consistency in the analysis and reflects the transitivity assumption of consumer preference. If two indifference curves intersected, the point of intersection would mean or represent two different satisfaction levels simultaneously, which is logically impossible. Each combination of goods can provide only one level of satisfaction for a given consumer. Further, higher curves mean higher satisfaction. As we have seen, indifference curves that are further away from the origin represent higher level of satisfaction. This reflects the assumption that consumers prefer more of goods to fewer goods, other things being equal. A curve that lies above and to the right of another curve represents superior combinations that include more of at least one good without less of the other. Rational consumer will always prefer such superior combination when they are available. This property allows us to create a preference ordering across different indifference curves, making it possible to analyze consumer choices and predict behavior when circumstances change. Now let us move to the very important concept of marginal rate of substitution. The marginal rate of substitution represents how much of one good a consumer is willing to give up to obtain one more unit of another good while staying on the same indifference curve. It measures the personal trade-off rate between two goods for maintaining equal satisfaction. Think of MRS as your personal exchange rate between two goods. If you are willing to give up 2 cups of coffee to get 1 additional hour of sleep, your MRS of sleep for coffee is 2. This rate reflects your personal preferences and circumstances. The MRS varies along the indifference curve, typically decreasing as you move from left to right. This changing rate reflects how your willingness to trade changes as the quantity of goods change. Now, what is the economic significance of MRS? The MRS reflects the relative importance consumers place on different goods at specific consumption levels. When you have a lot of one good and little of another, you are typically willing to give up more of the abundant good to get additional units of scarce good. This concept explains why people diversify their consumption rather than specializing in just one or two goods in their entire preference. As they accumulate more of single good, its relative value decreases, making the other goods relatively more attractive. The MRS also helps explain market behavior and price relationships. In competitive markets, relative prices of goods tend to reflect common MRS of consumers, creating equilibrium condition. Now let us understand the aspect of diminishing MRS. The marginal rate of substitution or MRS typically diminishes as we move along an indifference curve from left to right. This means consumers become less willing to substitute one good for another as they already have more of the first good. For example, if you have many books but few movies, you might be willing to trade 3 books for one movie. But if you already have many movies and few books, you might only be willing to trade one book for one movie or even lesser. This diminishing pattern reflects the human tendency to seek balance and variety in consumption. It explains why indifference curves are convex to the origin and why consumers typically choose balanced consumption bundles. Now let us look at the factors affecting marginal rate of substitution. Personal preferences strongly influence MRS values. Someone who loves reading might have a low MRS when trading books for other goods, meaning they are reluctant to give up books. Someone who prefers active entertainment might have high MRS for books. Current consumption levels also affect MRS. The more you currently have of one good relative to another, the more willing you are to trade some of it away. This relationship drives the diminishing MRS pattern. External factors like social norms, cultural background and life circumstances can also influence MRS values. A student might have different trade-off rates between study and leisure time compared to a working professional. Now let us move to understanding consumer preferences based on these topics which we have done. First is preference relations. Consumer preferences can be expressed through three basic relations, that is strict preference, indifference and weak preference. Strict preference means clearly preferring one option over another. Indifference means being equally satisfied with both the options, and weak preference means preferring one option or being indifferent between them. These relationships form the foundation of ordinal utility theory. They are based on how consumers actually think about choices rather than requiring them to assign numerical values to their satisfaction level. Understanding these relationships helps explain why consumers make certain choices and how they are likely to respond to changes in available options or circumstances. For meaningful economic analysis, consumer preferences must be consistent over time and across situations. This doesn't mean preferences never change, but rather they follow logical patterns and don't contradict themselves. Consistency requires transitivity. That is, as we have known, if you prefer A to B and B to C, you must prefer A to C. It also requires that preferences don't reverse arbitrarily. If you prefer coffee to tea yesterday, you shouldn't prefer tea to coffee today unless something meaningful has changed, a drastic change. This consistency assumption allows economists to predict consumer behavior and analyze market outcomes. Without some degree of consistency, consumer theory would be impossible. Now, the completeness assumption means consumers can compare any two combinations of goods and express a preference relationship. They might prefer one combination, the other, or indifferent between them, but they can always make some comparison. This ensures that indifference curves analysis can handle any choice situation. It doesn't mean consumers always have strong opinions about every possible combination, just that they can make comparisons when necessary. Completeness makes the theoretical framework comprehensive and allows for complete analysis of consumer choice problems. If we look at stability and change, while preferences are assumed to be stable for analytical purposes, they do change over time due to experience, learning, aging and changing circumstances. A young person's preferences might differ significantly from the preferences of an older adult. The indifference curve framework can accommodate changing preferences by allowing the curve to shift over time. New experiences might make a consumer value certain goods more highly, shifting their indifferent curves. Understanding how and why preferences change helps explain long-term consumption patterns and market evolution. Now let us quickly look at the different types of indifference curves. First, we have perfect substitutes. That is, when two goods are perfect substitutes, consumers can replace one with the other at a constant rate without affecting satisfaction. The indifference curves for perfect substitutes are generally straight lines with constant slope. For example, perfect substitutes such as different brands of identical products like generic versus brand name aspirin, for example, or different combinations of currency. Consumers care only about the total amount, not a specific mix. The straight line indifference curve reflects that consumers are willing to trade those goods at a fixed rate regardless of how much they currently have of each. The slope of the line shows the substitution rate. Then we have perfect complements. Perfect complements are goods that must be consumed together in fixed proportion to provide satisfaction. The indifference curves for perfect complements are L-shaped or at 90 degrees or right angles at the optimal consumption ratios. Classic example would include left shoe and right shoe, or cars and steering wheels. Having extra unit of one of these goods without corresponding units of the other goods provides no additional satisfaction. The L-shaped curves show that consumers won't substitute between these goods. They want them in specific proportions. Beyond the optimal ratio, additional units of either goods provide no extra satisfaction. Now, if we summarize the session, then indifference curve analysis part 1 that we have seen introduces students to fundamental concepts of ordinal utility, consumer preferences analysis, and other aspects related to it. The ordinal approach represents a major advancement over cardinal utility theory by focusing on preference ranking rather than impossible utility measurements. This makes economic analysis more realistic and scientifically sound. Despite its theoretical nature, the indifference curve approach provides valuable insights for business strategy, market analysis, and policy evaluation. The indifference curve framework represents one of the most important tools in microeconomic analysis, providing insights into consumer behavior that remain relevant for modern business and policy decisions. So, for business administration students, understanding these concepts provide a very strong base to building economic models and understanding them, and hence taking optimal decisions for businesses which are constantly focusing on consumer preferences and choice. I hope you understood and enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.